Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to go over externalities and market failure. This is a continuation of the market society lecture. So the overarching questions we'll answer today is what is an externality? How can the public and private sector avoid externalities? And what is market failure? Okay, so let's start with externalities. So externalities are defined as the impact of an economic transaction or a series of transactions which is not felt by anyone in that transaction. Okay, so an externality, and you think about the name, like don't get tripped up on the long word here. Externality refers to an external impact. Okay, so when you make a decision to buy or sell something, both parties are involved in there. Anything that happens to anyone not involved in that decision, that's an externality. So we can have positive and negative externalities. And again, these are pretty common sense if you think about it. A positive externality just means that some external person or party benefits from that transaction. So the key word here is it's a benefit. So it's a positive externality. A negative externality, as you might guess, is when it hurts. So it hurts the external party. Okay. So again, an externality is just the generic word for an impact. If it's positive, it benefits someone else. If it's negative, it hurts someone else. Now, to make sure we're clear on this, and it gets a little tricky, if the external party is properly compensated, it is neither positive nor negative. Now, there's a little bit of confusion out here in the literature on this, but here's how I want you to think about an externality. If it happens to someone not involved in the decision, it's an externality. If it benefits that person, it's positive. If it hurts that person, it's negative. If that person, let's say they get hurt, let's say they incur a negative externality and they're properly compensated for that. Let's say they get, we'll go over some examples here. They get sick or something from pollution. If they get paid a fair market value to compensate for that sickness, then it's considered even and it's not a positive or negative externality. It's just an externality. Okay? So let's go over a couple of examples. So I want you to think about pollution. Okay, so this is the smoke coming out of a tailpipe, smoke coming out of a tractor trailer, whatever those things are called, exhaust pipes, exhaust stacks, and this is a power plant. So think about some of the impacts that could happen to someone outside of this, whoever made this decision to make this transaction that caused this pollution. So let's go with the car because it's a nice easy one we can all relate to. I drove my car to work today. On the way to work, I emitted some fumes out of my exhaust system out the back of the car. Now, those emissions were a result of me making that choice to have the car, to drive the car, to purchase the gas, etc. So there's a cost associated with it to me, having driven the car, and there's a benefit to the person whom I gave money to. Okay. So those parties, they don't count toward this externality. However, if you think about it, think about some of the possible external costs or even benefits of me emitting that pollution. And I can think of one really big one, and that is some people, let's say I drove through a town, so my little town that I live in, maybe somebody is really sensitive to particulate matter and they have respiratory problems, and this caused them to have a little bit of an asthma issue, or maybe it just contributed ever so slightly to their asthma. That's a real cost to someone in the real world, but the key here is that did not pay for that. I don't pay for that at all. So that's an example of a negative externality. Someone was hurt, however small or big, in however small or big a way, but the key here is that they were hurt and they had no choice. So they didn't make the decision that contributed to me driving to work, and yet they were impacted by it. That's a classic externality, okay? And so you could go through anything with any type of pollution. Pollution is a really commonly cited one for externality. So that's often affiliated with negative externalities. So if you think about, let's think about some positive externalities. So education is very often cited as having positive externalities. So you think about, you're all taking a class right now, assuming you're watching this because you're taking the class. you're paying for the education, so you have a cost, and then the institution is receiving your money, and so they have a benefit. So that's the mutual decision that you came to. But you think about it, as you go through your college career and then you get your degree, become more educated. Think about some of the benefits to society of you becoming educated. So go ahead and press pause and think about it. But some important ones are, an educated population in a country generally contributes to better, more democratic systems, better economies, maybe more peace, safer. If you have everyone's fully educated, maybe the neighborhoods are safer. So there's all these good positive benefits of you and other people becoming educated. But again, that benefit is not included in the cost of your education. And that's actually what a lot of people point to as a reason that we should make public education free and all, colleges, at least state colleges, free, because there is this net benefit to society. So it's sort of, if there's a positive externality, it's almost like you're overpaying for your education because society benefits a lot more than what you pay. Okay, so again, to reiterate, the externality is an impact of a transaction that's not felt by anyone in that transaction. Okay, so we've gone over positive and negative externalities. So the social cost, okay, if you think about the pollution example, the social cost is the sum of all of the costs to everyone in society. So the cost to you and the cost to anyone that was impacted by it, okay? And so an important concept here is market failure. And so market failure is when the social cost, so the cost to everyone, is higher than your own private cost. So let's go back to the pollution example. My private cost, the private cost is the cost of the individual that pays, engages in the transaction and pays the money. So I paid money for gas for my car, etc. So I bore this private cost. However, the social cost, the cost to society, was probably greater because other people were negatively impacted, however slightly, by the pollution that I emitted from my tailpipe. And so in that case, if I pay less than the actual cost to society, that's an example of what we call market failure. And market failure is what they call when the outcome of the transaction is not socially optimal. In other words, it hasn't evened out. There's more costs out there than the private party actually paid. And this is a really important concept in sustainability and economics, and it's a known phenomenon and something that's really hard to correct. Okay, and so I want you to think about why would a market failure happen, and you can go ahead and think about this. So why are costs not always internalized? And there's a lot of reasons for it, and I'm not going to go over all of them. I mean, I don't even know all of them, but you can probably, if you want to think about it, press pause and think about it. It's really difficult, first of all, to privatize all of the cost of me driving to work. I mean, how do I know how much of my pollution contributed to someone's asthma attack or someone's respiratory problem? It's really hard to know, so it's hard to cost that in to the price of gas. Okay, and there are other, I mean, a lot of these issues boil down to it's just really hard to do, or it's really easy to ignore. Okay. So again, just to kind of go through this again, if you think about the pollution and you want to think about externalities, I want you to think about the private cost, which we've already gone over, of me buying and using gas. Think about some of the external costs, and think about, do you think this actually is an example of market failure? And generally speaking, pollution is one of the classic examples of market failure. It's difficult to price. Most pollution, especially this sort of diffuse pollution, power plants and tailpipes and so forth, because it just sort of blows out into the wind and you don't really know where it ends up and you don't know exactly what the negative impacts of that individual amount of pollution is. You may know as an aggregate overall what the pollution from cars cause, but it's hard to attribute that to you. Okay, so pollution is a classic example of market failure. And then we went over education. And education, again, you want to think about what's the private cost of you earning the degree and what's the external benefit. And in this case, the private benefit that you get is not greater than the total benefit. So it's actually less. So you benefit a little less than society as a whole. So that's, again, a positive externality. Okay. All right, so hopefully you watched the video. If you haven't watched the video yet, you can click on the PDF of this and watch it, or it's posted on Blackboard, or excuse me, the course website. And so this is something called electronic waste. Sorry, I should put that on there, but e-waste is something, it's a really important phenomenon. And according to the United Nations, about 42 million tons of e-waste. So e-waste is a pretty good image. This is a snapshot from the video itself. If you look at the components of the inside of electronics, computers, TVs, cell phones, and so forth, there's a lot of valuable material in there: copper, lead, cobalt. There's all these really valuable metals that, in small quantities, they're not really worth much. But if you can sort of take apart all these electronics and then gather up all these supplies, you can actually, there's a lot of valuable material in there. But the problem is a lot of those are also very toxic, and we'll go over this in a minute. But a lot of them are really nasty chemicals. There's mercury in there that's a terrible neurotoxin that really damages children's brains. Cobalt, lead is a neurotoxin. So there's all kinds of nasty stuff in there. And you don't need to know these numbers, but the point is there is a lot of chemicals out there in electronics that are being taken apart by hand. And as you saw in the video, as you can imagine, if you're actually physically, there's people working, they're taking apart this electronic waste, and a lot of the waste seeps into the ground. It's not properly maintained. You have people that, they're not even wearing masks, and they could be breathing in fumes. There's examples of kids just like running around on these piles. So anyway, this is a very important problem that still goes on today, particularly in far eastern countries. And a lot of what if you look at the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, they found about 12.5% of e-waste was recycled this way. So it's a really big problem. And the question is this market failure? So I want you to think about what that means. And market failure would mean, are we actually paying for all the costs? So there's people that get sick, they lose their crops, their kids get brain damage, they have health issues, whatever. If those costs are not all integrated into the price of the computer or the phone that you're looking at right now, then that's an actual example of market failure, because it's not socially optimal. All the costs have not been included in that transaction. So this is a market failure, and I want you, you can think about how you would fix that. There have been laws passed. They've tried to make it so that manufacturers have to take back their computers and so forth. So there are some issues out there, and I encourage you to look at some of the solutions. And just to give you an idea, it's probably hard to read this on your screen, but this is posted on the PowerPoint. This is just a list of a lot of these toxic chemicals. You have poison, neurological, carcinogen, organ toxin, carcinogen, central nervous system problem, central nervous system, carcinogen. So these are all common ingredients of e-waste, and a lot of these are just out there in these open sort of piles, okay? All right, and so the last thing we'll go over here is the last video from Milton Friedman when he talks about market failure. And it may sound like a silly example, but he was giving a talk on a campus, and he said, he explained how having a dirty shirt on Rochester's campus is an externality. So I want you to pause and think about, how could a dirty shirt on a college campus, and I'll give you a hint, it involves a smokestack on campus, how could that be a market or an externality? And the premise here is that there's power plants on campus to provide heat and or electricity. So they emit pollution out of their smokestacks. And he's saying, if you're a student or whoever, you're just on campus and you walk through the campus, your shirt gets dirty because of the smoke from the smokestack. And if so that's an externality in itself, because you did not make the decision to burn the coal or whatever they're burning, and yet you were impacted by that. Now, he also says that if a university doesn't pay for your shirt, then it's a negative externality. Even if it's something as simple as, well, now I have to wash my shirt, there's a cost associated with that. It's time, even the little bit of money to pay for the electricity to wash your shirt, it is a cost that was foisted on you because of a decision that someone else made. Okay, So it is an externality. It's a pretty simple example, but it's a good one. And so he talks about how to fix this in the role of government. And so in the video, he really talks about, well, yes, the government may need to play a role in this. And he's, in typical sort of neoliberal fashion, libertarian fashion, if you will, he says that's fine, but you need to be really careful that you don't say, market failure happens, government needs to step in and take control. He's saying, yeah, maybe, but maybe we need to look at market-based solutions as well. But to be very clear about this, even the staunchest of libertarians understand that we need to have some role of government. Okay, so government needs to play some role. If nothing else, we need a fair court system. And if we have a fair court system, and let's say my shirt gets dirtied, I should be able to take, if I can prove that I own that shirt, and I can prove that your smoke soiled my shirt, and there's a fair court system, then I should be able to take you to court and say, look, I need compensation for this. Now, it's just over, kind of a simple example, and it's probably not worth going to court over. But you can think of a bigger problem. I have a lake on my property, and someone poisons it. I should be able to go to court. And so, neoliberal, from a neoliberal perspective, it's okay to have government. Like, we need a good, fair government to at least operate a court system and adjudicate any of these problems. But we have to be careful about not going too far. Okay, so again, neoliberals are okay with this. Milton Friedman even says, yeah, that's fine. And you look at his writings and everything, he's okay with it, but it has to respect private property rights. That's generally the bottom line of neoliberal, which is really libertarian, and that is private properties. But I want you to think about, go ahead and press pause and think about, if this system is in place, what are some potential issues that could cause this to not actually work? For everybody involved, particularly the person whose shirt got soiled. And so 3 really big ones. First of all, what if you can't prove it's their smoke? That's a big problem. And that kind of fits into this one. What if they have better lawyers? Better lawyers generally mean better outcomes. And especially you have a lawyer that can, prove or sow some doubt in saying, look, it may be some of the smoke damaged it, but there's no way to prove that our smoke actually was the one that caused all that soiling. There's a power plant, 5 miles down the road, and some of that smoke. So anyway, if you can't fully prove it, then it's really hard to be properly compensated. And based on the criminal justice system that we have, better lawyers usually mean better outcome. And finally, a really important one, and this has been popping up a lot lately, what if the justice system is biased? There are a lot of studies that have shown that outcomes of trials change depending on particularly race. And there's one really big study, just as an aside, that people analyzed the sentencing outcomes for, I think it was federal courts, and they found that on average, if you a black male and you take a white male, if they have the same criminal history, the same background, and they commit the same crime, on average, the black male gets 20% longer sentence. Now, this is not to say that any judges are biased. It's more of an inherent. It's just perception or whatever it is. But these are peer-reviewed research that have shown that the justice system is not exactly fair. And again, this is not to demean our system. It's a good system of laws, but there are certainly flaws in the system, and that's a concern for people when you say, all right, well, look, if you can prove it, then you're fine. It's not always that easy. Okay, so the basic summary here is that, remember, externalities are a cost of a transaction that occurs to someone outside of the transaction. Remember, they can be positive or negative. If all social costs are paid for, then there's no positive or negative externality, but it is still an externality. And negative externalities are a sign of market failure. And even neoliberals admit that markets may have limits, market failure happens, and that there is a role for government. And again, just to really summarize this in the last class, remember that markets are very, very good at managing things that have good feedback, that can be replenished or replaced, are not necessarily essential. And so, like, a soiled shirt, that's great. We can sort of, configure the market so it can properly compensate people for it. But remember, markets are very bad at managing things with non-market value. Externalities, so when the source is difficult to identify, like we talked about with pollution, market systems really has trouble with it. Again, things that happen in the future and a few other things. But I just wanted to summarize this because it kind of sounds like, we're being critical of markets here, but markets are really, really, really good and really effective. And all else being equal, markets are probably the best way to actually manage um, most resources, but there are certain ways that markets really fail. And even people that are strong advocates of the free market do have these questions as well.